My boss fired me on stage in front of the entire company. 300 people were watching when he called my name, smiled into the microphone, and said, I was the reason our biggest client might leave. What he didn't know was that I was the only person keeping that client from walking. And within 6 months, I'd be the reason his company nearly collapsed. The day my boss fired me, he made sure there was an audience, not a private meeting, not even a fake HR call with a glass wall and a sympathy face. No, Greg wanted a spectacle. He wanted my humiliation to echo. So he did it on stage. I was standing off to the side of our quarterly town hall in a navy sheath dress and heels that were already killing me, holding my tablet and waiting for my cue to hand him the updated client retention slides. 300 employees were packed into the auditorium. Sales, account teams, operations, even interns in the back rows whispering and clutching branded notebooks like this was some TED Talk instead of corporate theater. Greg loved corporate theater. He stood under the stage lights with his expensive smile and his perfectly rehearsed vision for the future voice, talking about innovation, alignment, and accountability. The kind of words men like him use right before they ruin someone's life and call it leadership. Then he clicked to a slide that wasn't in the deck I approved. My stomach dropped. It was a red performance chart with my name on it. Maya Bennett, Director of Strategic Accounts. There were bullet points under it. Communication failures. Client instability. Lack of cross-functional leadership. For one second, I honestly thought it had to be a mistake. A formatting error. Some sick internal draft that got loaded by accident. Then Greg looked straight at me. Actually, he said, smiling like this was all perfectly reasonable. Since Maya is here, I think transparency matters. Don't you? You know that feeling when a room changes temperature all at once? When people stop shifting in their seats and suddenly become very still because they realize they're about to witness something ugly? That's what it felt like. I heard somebody in the second row whisper, "Oh my God." Greg kept going. At Varelo, we reward results. And when leadership fails to protect key relationships, there have to be consequences. My fingers locked around the tablet so hard they started to ache. Protect key relationships. That was the phrase that almost made me laugh. Because for the last 4 years, I had been the one protecting the company's most valuable relationship. Not Greg. Not the polished idiots he dragged into golf outings and steak dinners for LinkedIn photos. Me, Hawthorne Biotech, our biggest client, 38% of annual revenue, 7 figures in recurring contracts, the kind of account that kept executive bonuses fat and shareholders calm. Officially, Greg managed that relationship. In reality, I did. I was the one taking 6:15 a.m. calls from Singapore because Hawthorne's procurement head was traveling. I was the one who remembered their CEO's assistant preferred text over email when something was urgent. I was the one who spent 2 Christmas Eves rewriting fulfillment terms so their legal team wouldn't walk. I knew their renewal history, their pain points, their internal politics, which VP hated surprises, which one needed flattery, and which one would kill a deal over a delayed follow-up. Greg knew where to take them for drinks. That was about it. But he had seniority, the title, the board visibility, and the kind of confidence mediocre men are born wearing like a custom suit. I took one step toward the stage. "Greg," I said, keeping my voice calm, "this isn't the approved deck." A few heads turned toward me. Greg didn't even blink. "No," he said into the microphone. "It's the honest one." There was a ripple through the audience. I saw Paula from finance lower her eyes. Ben from legal looked frozen. My own team looked horrified. Greg clicked to the next slide. "After careful review," he said, "we've decided to make an immediate leadership change." And then he said the words that split my life into before and after. Maya Bennett is no longer with Varelo effective today. Right there, on stage, like I was a cautionary tale, like I was a prop in his little lesson about accountability. I don't remember breathing. I do remember the silence. Then the soft, awful sound of people pretending not to react. Someone coughed. A chair squeaked. My ears rang so loudly I barely heard Greg add, "Security will help coordinate transition logistics." Security. As if I was going to flip a table and start screaming. I looked at him for a long moment, and I swear I saw it in his face. Relief. Satisfaction. He thought he'd won. He thought public humiliation would make me small. What he didn't know was that 3 hours before that town hall, I had already gotten a text from Daniel Cross, COO of Hawthorne Biotech. Not on email, not through Greg. Directly to me. Need to talk. Urgent. Call me when you can. Don't loop in Greg yet. And standing there under those stage lights with my career supposedly bleeding out in front of the whole company, I suddenly understood something. Greg thought he had just made me powerless. He had actually just cut himself off from the only person who knew how to keep Hawthorne from walking. I handed the company tablet to the security guard before he could ask for it. Then I looked Greg dead in the eye and said, clearly enough for the front rows to hear, "You just made the most expensive mistake of your life." And that would have been dramatic enough. But the real twist came 48 hours later, when their biggest competitor called me with an offer, and Daniel Cross asked if I was finally ready to stop saving a company that didn't deserve me. 48 hours after Greg fired me on stage, my phone rang with a number I hadn't seen in years. I was sitting at my kitchen counter in sweatpants, surrounded by half-finished job applications and a very judgmental-looking mug of cold coffee. My laptop screen still had the Varello careers page open, out of habit, I guess. Like maybe they'd magically reverse the humiliation and ask me back. They didn't. Instead, my phone lit up with the name Laura Chen. If you work in enterprise tech sales, Laura Chen is the kind of person you hear about before you ever meet. Brilliant strategist, ruthless negotiator, and currently the EVP of partnerships at Helixia, Varello's biggest competitor. I stared at the phone for a second before answering. "Hello?" "Maya Bennett," Laura said, her voice calm and sharp. "I was wondering how long it would take before you called me." I blinked. "Called you?" She chuckled softly. "Don't play modest. The industry group chat exploded after Greg's little performance." Of course it had. Corporate leaders love to pretend everything is confidential. In reality, embarrassing news travels through the industry faster than a meme. Laura continued, "So let me ask you something directly. Were you actually responsible for Hawthorne?" My silence was answer enough. She let out a quiet whistle. "Wow." Then she said the sentence that changed everything. "We should talk." 2 hours later, I was sitting in a quiet corner of a downtown hotel lobby across from Laura Chen, who had a legal pad, a fountain pen, and the calm confidence of someone who already knew the ending of the story. "You handled the Hawthorne account," she said, tapping the pen lightly. "Not Greg." "Yes." "For how long?" "4 years." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "And he took credit." "Publicly?" "Always." Laura leaned back thinking. Then she asked the question that made my pulse jump. "And Daniel Cross trusts you?" I nodded slowly. Daniel Cross wasn't just some executive. As COO of Hawthorne Biotech, he controlled vendor relationships worth hundreds of millions. And he was also the one who had texted me the morning of the town hall. Laura studied my face for a moment. "Interesting timing," she said. "What do you mean?" She slid the legal pad toward me. On it were 2 words written in neat handwriting. "Contract renewal." "Hawthorne's master services agreement with Varello expires in 8 months," she said. "Correct?" "Yes." "And they've been unhappy with support delays for the last year?" I stared at her. "How do you—" Laura smiled. "Because Helixia has been trying to get that account for 3 years." My heart started beating faster. She leaned forward slightly. "But here's the problem," she said. "Every time we get close, Daniel Cross shuts the conversation down." I already knew why. Because Daniel trusted me, not the company. Laura tapped the pen again. Until 2 days ago, she said. Right then, my phone buzzed on the table. A message from Daniel. I glanced down. Did Greg really fire you? Laura noticed my expression. Daniel? I nodded. Answer him, she said. My fingers hovered over the screen. Yes, 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Then the reply came. That explains everything. Another message followed. We need to talk about the renewal. I felt a strange mix of adrenaline and disbelief spreading through my chest. Because suddenly, the situation Greg had created looked very different. He thought firing me made me irrelevant. Instead, it had removed the one thing keeping me loyal to Varello. Laura must have seen the realization on my face. Here's the thing, Maya, she said quietly. Accounts don't belong to companies. She paused. They belong to relationships. I looked down at Daniel's messages again. 4 years of midnight calls, 4 years of crisis fixes, 4 years of trust. Laura folded her hands on the table. If you came to Helixia, she said calmly, I believe Hawthorne would follow you. My pulse was pounding now. Daniel hasn't said that. She shrugged slightly. He doesn't need to. Then she slid a document across the table. An offer letter. Senior Vice President. Strategic Partnerships. A salary that made my last job look like an internship. But that wasn't the part that made me smile. The real line was near the bottom. Performance bonus tied to acquisition of Hawthorne Biotech account. Laura watched my reaction carefully. I assume, she said, you'd enjoy proving Greg wrong. I let out a slow breath. Enjoy wasn't the word, because suddenly I could picture it. Greg standing confidently in another town hall, projecting revenue forecasts, promising investors that Hawthorne's renewal was secure. And then the moment everything collapsed. I picked up the pen, but before signing, I looked up at Laura. There's something you should know, I said. What's that? Hawthorne's leadership is attending the Global Biotech Summit next month. Laura's eyes lit up. The summit was the biggest conference in our industry. Thousands of executives, press coverage, investor panels, and live announcements. I smiled slightly. And Greg is presenting Varello's quarterly projections on the main stage. Laura slowly leaned back in her chair. Understanding dawned across her face. Oh, she said softly. Yes. Because suddenly the revenge wasn't just possible. It was going to happen live, and Greg had absolutely no idea. A month later, I was standing backstage at the Global Biotech Summit, watching the live stream of Greg Walker destroying his own company. He just didn't know it yet. The main conference hall was massive. Thousands of executives, investors, analysts, and journalists packed into rows of seats under blinding stage lights. Giant LED screens displayed the Varello logo behind Greg as he stood confidently at the podium, clicking through slides about strategic growth. Classic Greg. Tailored suit, perfect smile, the same smug confidence he'd worn the day he fired me. Over the past year, he was saying smoothly, Varello has strengthened its relationships with key enterprise partners. I almost laughed, because sitting 10 feet behind me in the VIP section was Daniel Cross, COO of Hawthorne Biotech, and next to him was Laura Chen. Neither of them had spoken publicly yet. That part was coming. But first, Greg had to finish his presentation. On the screen behind him, a slide appeared. Projected revenue growth, 18% increase. And right under that projection was the line that made my chest tighten with satisfaction. Hawthorne Biotech, strategic renewal pending. Greg pointed to it confidently. As you can see, he said to the audience, our long-term partnership with Hawthorne remains one of the most stable revenue drivers for the company. In the front rows, several investors nodded. Analysts typed notes. Phones recorded video. Greg kept talking. Negotiations are progressing extremely well, and we expect a smooth renewal later this year. Backstage, Laura leaned closer to me and whispered, He really believes that. Oh, he does, I said quietly. Because Greg had spent the last month telling investors that losing me meant nothing. He'd sent out a press statement saying Varello had deep bench leadership. He'd reassured the board that client relationships were fully secure. And the whole time, Daniel Cross had been having very different conversations. With me. Greg clicked to the final slide. Thank you all, he said, smiling. Varello's future has never been stronger. Applause filled the room. He stepped away from the podium, clearly pleased with himself. And that's when the conference host stepped back on stage. Thank you, Greg, she said. Before we move to the next panel, we actually have a special announcement from one of the industry's leading biotech companies. Greg paused halfway down the stage stairs. Something in the room shifted. Please welcome Daniel Cross, COO of Hawthorne Biotech. The applause grew louder as Daniel stood up from the VIP section. Greg froze. I could actually see the moment confusion crossed his face. Because Daniel wasn't supposed to be part of this session. Daniel walked up the stairs calmly, shaking the host's hand before stepping to the microphone. The room quieted. I'll keep this brief, he said. His voice carried easily through the auditorium. At Hawthorne, partnerships are built on trust, responsiveness, and leadership. Greg had turned around now. He was watching from the side of the stage. Daniel continued. For several years, one individual consistently delivered those things for us. My heart was beating faster now. Daniel smiled slightly. Maya Bennett. Several people in the audience turned their heads immediately. I stepped out from behind the stage curtain. The murmurs started instantly. Greg's face went pale. Daniel gestured toward me. Unfortunately, he said calmly, Varello recently made the decision to remove Maya from their organization. The murmuring grew louder. Phones lifted. Cameras zoomed. Greg looked like he'd been hit by a truck. Daniel continued. So, Hawthorne made a decision of our own. He paused, and then he said the sentence that detonated Greg's entire presentation. Hawthorne Biotech will not be renewing our partnership with Varello. The room erupted. Gasps, whispering, dozens of phones recording. Daniel raised his hand slightly for quiet. Instead, he said, we are proud to announce a new strategic partnership with Helixia, led by Senior Vice President Maya Bennett. For a second, the entire room seemed to explode with noise. Applause, reporters shouting questions, investors already typing frantic messages. And on the giant screens behind the stage, the Helixia logo replaced Varello's. I looked over at Greg. He was still standing at the side of the stage, completely frozen. His company's largest client had just walked away, in front of the entire industry. And the person leading the new deal was the same woman he'd fired on stage. Laura leaned toward him as she passed. Bad day for projections, she said sweetly. Later that afternoon, the financial news broke. Varello's stock dropped 19% in 3 hours. Analysts called the loss of Hawthorne catastrophic. The board demanded explanations. And somewhere in the middle of that chaos, Greg finally understood something. The woman he tried to humiliate in front of the whole company was the same one who had just orchestrated the most expensive mistake of his career. Funny thing is, I almost felt bad for him. Almost. But then I remembered the stage, and the microphone, and the way he smiled when he thought he'd taken everything from me. Turns out, he just gave me the perfect audience. But the story didn't end there. That night, the summit hosted a networking reception on the rooftop terrace overlooking the city. Investors, executives, reporters, everyone was there, and the news about Hawthorne had already spread through the entire conference. People kept stopping me. Are you Maya Bennett? I saw the announcement this afternoon. That move was brilliant. Across the terrace, I spotted Greg standing near the bar, surrounded by 2 board members and a PR advisor, who looked like he was having a panic attack. For a moment, Greg looked up. Our eyes met across the crowd. He looked smaller somehow. Not physically, but the confidence was gone. The smug certainty that he controlled the room had disappeared. I raised my glass slightly. Not mockingly, not cruelly, just acknowledgement. Because the truth was simple. Greg thought companies owned the power, but in our industry, power doesn't come from titles. It comes from trust. And the one person who had built that trust for 4 years was the same person he decided to fire for applause. So, if there's one lesson in all of this, it's this. If someone is quietly holding your entire business together, maybe don't humiliate them on stage, because one day they might get their own stage. And when they do, everyone will be watching.